Rebecca Jameson had always been the type to appreciate the quieter aspects of life, away from the bustling crowds and constant noise that seemed to define the pace of modern existence. After spending years working tirelessly in a high-pressure corporate job, she had made the bold decision to leave it all behind. The city, the deadlines, the relentless pace, they all started to feel like a cage rather than a thriving environment. With a mix of excitement and apprehension, Rebecca found herself packing her belongings and moving to a small suburban neighborhood, hoping for peace, solitude, and a fresh start. She found a house nestled at the edge of the neighborhood, an old, charming building with a slight air of abandonment around it, its once vibrant paint peeling away like layers of forgotten memories. The house stood on a quiet street, tucked between other aging homes, each with its own stories, each carrying the weight of time. The land was vast, offering her plenty of space to breathe, to build, and to reimagine a life that had grown far too routine. The prospect of finally having a space to call her own, a place to create and thrive, was overwhelming in the best way. Rebecca wasn't one for unnecessary embellishments, but she was also a meticulous planner. Before settling in, she spent weeks ensuring the house would be secure, modern, and as comfortable as possible without losing the charm that made it special. One of the first things she decided to install was a video doorbell, a simple, practical solution for a woman living alone in a house far from the hustle and bustle of the city. It wasn't out of paranoia, but rather a practical measure. She knew how quickly things could escalate when someone felt vulnerable, and in her new neighborhood, security was a constant concern. The video doorbell would give her peace of mind, allowing her to screen visitors and, in the case of emergencies, document any unusual activity around her property. As she installed the device, Rebecca felt an odd sense of empowerment. It was an unobtrusive feature, sleek and modern, and the idea that she could now monitor her surroundings felt like an extra layer of protection against the unknown. Little did she know, this seemingly harmless installation would be the catalyst for everything that would follow. It was supposed to be a step towards tranquility, a simple act of enhancing her safety, but in the quiet neighborhood that she had just begun to call home, it would soon become the first spark in a growing conflict. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The neighbors waved when they saw her, and the sounds of children playing in the streets became a comforting backdrop to her days. But then, a few weeks after the doorbell was installed, Rebecca began to notice subtle shifts in the atmosphere around her. At first, it was small things. A brief glance from a neighbor she didn't know well, a couple of awkward exchanges at the mailbox, and the occasional lingering look from someone standing near her yard. Nothing overtly alarming, but it was enough to make Rebecca uncomfortable. Her presence, her choices, were beginning to draw attention. She told herself it was nothing, just the natural curiosity that came with living in a tight-knit community, where people noticed changes, however small. Still, an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of her stomach. Then, one morning, it happened. She was returning home after a quiet walk around the neighborhood when she spotted a piece of paper sticking out of the gate. It wasn't the usual delivery notice or junk mail. It was a letter, hastily scribbled with a scrawl she didn't recognize. Opening it with a sense of dread, Rebecca read the words that would set everything into motion. "Remove the camera. It's inappropriate and intrusive." The message was unsigned, but its meaning was clear. Someone, or perhaps more than one someone, had taken issue with her decision to install the video doorbell. At first, she tried to dismiss it as an isolated incident, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. Who were these people? Why had they written her this letter? And why had they singled out the doorbell? It wasn't long before other subtle signs of discomfort began to surface. People she didn't recognize started walking past her house, slowing down as they did, their eyes shifting to the doorbell mounted above her front door. Rebecca felt it, the weight of judgment, the quiet disapproval. She began to notice the same few faces standing across the street, looking in her direction, their body language telling her everything she needed to know. Word had spread. and in the small, seemingly serene neighborhood, her choice had turned her into a subject of quiet suspicion. What had started as a simple act of personal security had now become a source of division, and Rebecca wasn't sure how to respond. The last thing she wanted was to stir conflict, but the tension in the air was palpable and she felt like she was slowly being pushed into a corner. By the time Rebecca made the decision to contact her lawyer, she had already sensed that something more was at play. This wasn't just about a doorbell. It was about control, about her place in the community, and about the boundaries that were being crossed in the name of conformity. The letter was just the beginning, an invitation, or perhaps a warning, from those who saw her as an outsider. As the tension escalated and whispers spread, Rebecca knew one thing for certain. This was only the start of a much bigger battle, one that would not just test her resolve, but also challenge her sense of self in a way she could never have anticipated. The letter was only the beginning of a problem that Rebecca never imagined would become so invasive. She had hoped it was just an isolated incident, a momentary lapse in judgment by a neighbor who had an issue with her newfound presence in the community. But as the days passed, the unsettling feeling only grew stronger, as if some invisible force was pushing her deeper into a web of scrutiny and suspicion. The subtle signs became more frequent, more pronounced. A neighbor would linger a little too long while walking their dog, staring at the doorbell, and then quickly turning away when Rebecca's eyes met theirs. There were those moments when she'd catch people talking in hushed voices as she passed by, only for them to fall silent as soon as they saw her approaching. It was as if they were trying to keep something from her, as though she had become the subject of their whispered gossip, an object of fascination in their otherwise predictable suburban lives. Rebecca, being naturally introverted, didn't have the urge to confront anyone outright. She preferred solitude, and the thought of stirring the pot didn't appeal to her, but it was becoming impossible to ignore the mounting tension that clung to the air around her. One morning, she was out front trimming the hedges when she saw a neighbor, a woman in her 50s with a stiff posture and an air of authority, walk past her house. The woman didn't even glance at her, but she slowed down, her eyes fixed on the doorbell, her lips pressed in a thin line. Rebecca watched as she passed, her heart sinking. There was something unmistakably cold about the way the woman looked at the doorbell. It was the look of someone who had already made up their mind about her, as if she were an outsider, an intruder who didn't belong. Rebecca found herself taking a deep breath, reminding herself that she wasn't doing anything wrong. But the nagging feeling of being watched, being judged, crept over her again, as real as the summer heat beating down on her back. By the end of the week, Rebecca knew she couldn't keep ignoring the whispers and the cold stares. Something was shifting in her neighborhood, and it wasn't just about the camera. It was about a deeper discomfort, a resistance to change that no one seemed willing to confront directly. She couldn't let herself be driven out by a handful of uncomfortable stares and anonymous letters. She had every right to live her life peacefully, to protect her home as she saw fit, but the question loomed larger and larger in her mind. How far would this opposition go? Would it escalate to something more? And, perhaps most pressing of all, who was behind all of this? Who had sent the letter? And why? Determined to find out, Rebecca decided to take the first step. She called a lawyer, someone who had been recommended by a friend in the city. The lawyer, whose name was Alice Porter, had a reputation for handling sensitive issues, and Rebecca hoped that Alice's experience could give her the tools she needed to navigate the murky waters of her new life. She explained her situation, the unsettling letter, and her growing concerns about the escalating tension in the neighborhood. Alice was calm on the other end of the phone, listening carefully, taking in every detail of Rebecca's story. After a few minutes of silence, Alice spoke, offering a clear, concise response that left Rebecca feeling both reassured and more alarmed than ever. "It sounds like you're dealing with more than just a neighborly dispute, Rebecca," Alice said in her steady voice. "This may be a case of deliberate harassment, and there are laws to protect you from that. But we need to dig deeper. Let's start by seeing if we can find out who sent that letter. Rebecca felt a surge of relief at the thought of someone finally taking her concerns seriously, but also a sinking feeling in her stomach. This was no longer just about a doorbell or an intrusion on her privacy. This was a sign that something more insidious was at work. She had already begun to suspect that the neighborhood wasn't as serene as it appeared on the surface, but hearing Alice's words confirmed her fears. The next few days were a blur of meetings with Alice, gathering documents and preparing for whatever lay ahead. Rebecca wasn't the type to make waves, but she knew she couldn't stay passive any longer. It wasn't just about her anymore. She had built a life here, and she wasn't going to let anyone drive her out, no matter how subtle their tactics were. But the deeper Rebecca delved into her research, the more she realized how many people in her community had become involved in the situation, whether they were aware of it or not. Alice suggested that they start by looking into the history of the neighborhood, its residents, and any potential connections that could shed light on who might be behind the opposition. As they began combing through public records, a pattern began to emerge. It wasn't just Rebecca who had faced resistance when it came to making changes or taking actions that didn't conform to the neighborhood's unspoken rules. Over the years, there had been other instances of people challenging the status quo. People who had moved in, renovated their homes, or even just made decisions that didn't align with the traditional, quiet nature of the area. In almost every case, there had been complaints, arguments, and in some instances, legal threats that seemed to come out of nowhere. It was as if the neighborhood had developed a culture of resistance, a collective effort to keep things exactly as they were, even if it meant alienating those who sought to make the area their own. Rebecca was shocked at the lengths some people had gone to maintain this sense of control, but she also began to understand something crucial. This wasn't just about her and her doorbell. It was about a power dynamic that had been in place for years, a hierarchy where newcomers were expected to conform to the established way of life, no questions asked, and anyone who dared to disrupt that delicate balance was quickly and ruthlessly targeted. It was at this point that Rebecca realized she wasn't just fighting for her right to have a doorbell on her property. She was fighting for her place in this community, for the right to be seen as an equal, not an outsider. As she sat in her lawyer's office looking at the evidence they had gathered, she made a silent vow to herself. She wasn't going to back down. Not this time. Not when she had already come so far. But just as she was beginning to feel a sense of control, the first sign that things were about to escalate further appeared. One afternoon, Rebecca returned home to find a note pinned to her door. It was simple, typed on plain white paper. "We know what you're doing. Stay out of this or there will be consequences." No signature, no indication of who had left it. But Rebecca knew, with chilling certainty, that this was only the beginning. The harassment was no longer subtle. It was overt, threatening, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. The catalyst had officially been set in motion, and Rebecca was about to learn just how far people would go to protect the status quo. Rebecca had hoped that the note left on her door would be a one-off incident, another baseless threat from someone who would soon lose interest. But deep down, she knew better. The feeling that had been gnawing at her since the day she installed the video doorbell was now undeniable. This wasn't going away. If anything, it was just the beginning. The threats were becoming more explicit, the pressure more suffocating, and the neighbors' disapproval increasingly visible. As she paced back and forth in her living room, the weight of her situation finally sunk in. She wasn't dealing with a few disgruntled neighbors. She was up against a system, a network of people bound together by their shared desire to control and maintain the status quo, and she was an intruder in their carefully curated world. She spent the next few days weighing her options, considering how to best proceed. The threats were starting to feel personal, and the subtle campaign of harassment was escalating. The usual quiet of the neighborhood now seemed suffocating, each glance from a neighbor loaded with meaning. She noticed more people standing at the edge of her property, lingering in places where they could get a glimpse of the front door, as if they were waiting for something to happen. Rebecca felt the walls of her new life closing in on her, and despite her best efforts to stay calm, the fear of what was to come started to take hold. It wasn't long before she started receiving phone calls in the middle of the night. At first, it was just the sound of silence on the other end of the line, the occasional click, and then the soft hum of someone hanging up. Rebecca tried to brush it off, thinking it was nothing more than a prank, but the calls became more frequent. They always came late at night, always silent, always with the same ominous feeling that someone was watching, waiting. It was as though they were testing her resolve, pushing her to the brink of fear. Then, one evening, as she walked out to the mailbox, she found it waiting for her. Another note. This one was different from the others. It was written in a careful, deliberate hand, the words sharp and menacing. "You think you can just waltz into our community and do as you please? You have no idea what you've started." The message was brief, but it carried a clear threat. Someone, or something, was organizing against her, and it was no longer a matter of passive resistance. This was active, targeted, and dangerous. Rebecca knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. She immediately called Alice, the lawyer who had been helping her navigate the initial legal aspects of her situation. When Alice answered, Rebecca could hear the urgency in her voice as soon as she explained the new developments. "We need to take this seriously, Rebecca. These are not just petty complaints anymore. These are threats, and they will escalate if we don't take immediate action." Alice's words hit Rebecca with a heavy finality. She wasn't just dealing with a few disgruntled neighbors. She was facing an organized effort to drive her out, to make her feel unwelcome in a place that was supposed to be her sanctuary. After their conversation, Alice suggested that they bring in a private investigator. It was clear to both of them that the situation had gone beyond what was manageable through legal channels alone. Someone was orchestrating these attacks, and it was time to figure out who. Rebecca agreed, albeit reluctantly. She didn't want to make the situation public or turn it into a spectacle, but she realized that she had no choice. She had to take control of this before it consumed her entirely. The investigator, a man named Mark Sullivan, was experienced in cases like hers, ones involving harassment and intimidation in close-knit communities. He was calm, methodical, and immediately set to work. In the days that followed, Mark spent hours gathering information on the neighborhood's history, looking into past disputes, and speaking with other residents. It wasn't long before Rebecca learned that this wasn't the first time someone had been forced out of the neighborhood due to similar tactics. There had been a couple of other individuals in recent years who had made changes to their properties, installed cameras, or taken steps to improve their security, only to find themselves the targets of relentless harassment. Each time, the attacks had been subtle at first, a strange phone call here, an anonymous letter there, but eventually they escalated. What troubled Rebecca most was the fact that all of the previous victims had eventually given in. They'd either moved away or sold their homes at a loss, choosing to escape the mounting pressure rather than stand their ground. This wasn't just about a few neighbors taking issue with her camera. It was a well-coordinated campaign to push her out. Rebecca couldn't ignore the pattern any longer. These weren't isolated incidents. This was an organized effort, and she had become its latest target. As the investigation continued, the pressure on Rebecca grew. It was no longer just phone calls or strange notes. One morning, she woke up to find that her car had been vandalized, the tires slashed, the windshield cracked. It wasn't just a random act of mischief, it was a direct message. Someone was trying to break her down, to force her into submission. The police, when called, seemed uninterested in investigating further, offering nothing but a shrug and the suggestion that she simply move on from the incident. Rebecca, feeling more isolated than ever, began to wonder if this wasn't just a local issue. Could there be something larger at play here? Was it possible that these coordinated attacks weren't just about the neighborhood, but part of something more widespread? Rebecca was no longer willing to sit idly by. She began documenting everything, taking photos of the vandalism, keeping records of the phone calls and notes. She wasn't just collecting evidence for her own peace of mind, she was preparing herself for the fight ahead. If she was going to stand her ground, she needed to be armed with more than just her intuition. She needed to be prepared for whatever might come next. Then, the final blow came. Late one night, as she was preparing to turn in, there was a knock at her door. Rebecca opened it cautiously, and standing there was a man in a dark suit. He handed her a legal notice informing her that she had been officially accused of disturbing the peace in the neighborhood. The notice went on to accuse her of violating community standards by installing the video doorbell, claiming that her actions had caused disruption and disharmony in the area. The language was vague, but the implications were clear. Rebecca was now facing not only harassment but also the possibility of legal action. They had escalated the game. As Rebecca read through the legal document, the full weight of the situation hit her. This wasn't just about a doorbell anymore. This was about her right to live in peace, to make decisions for herself without being punished for it. The community wasn't just rejecting her presence, it was actively trying to force her out, using the system and the law as their tools. The moment marked a turning point for Rebecca. No longer was she simply trying to defend herself from petty neighbors. She was now in a battle for her very right to exist in this community. She could no longer afford to be passive, to wait and hope that things would settle down. The stakes had been raised, and Rebecca was about to take a stand. The events that had unfolded in the weeks since Rebecca had installed her video doorbell had made it clear to her that she was no longer simply facing a few disgruntled neighbors, nor was this an isolated incident of community pushback. The more she investigated, the more she realized that her situation had morphed into something far more dangerous and insidious than she had initially feared. The threats, the harassment, the intimidation, all of it was just a small part of a much larger, more complex web of power, control, and manipulation. It wasn't just her property at stake anymore. It wasn't simply about her right to live in peace. What she was up against now was a community that had decided she didn't belong, a system that was entrenched in its resistance to change, and people who would go to any lengths to preserve the status quo. In this battle, Rebecca had unwittingly become both the outsider and the target, and the forces at work against her were vast and hidden in plain sight. Rebecca had been gathering evidence for weeks now, trying to make sense of the increasingly strange events surrounding her. The private investigator, Mark Sullivan, had uncovered some unsettling details about the neighborhood, but they were just the tip of the iceberg. Mark had gone through public records, old property disputes, and even interviewed a few older residents who had lived in the area long enough to remember the community's origins. What they found painted a picture that was far darker than Rebecca had imagined. It turned out that the neighborhood, while outwardly quiet and peaceful, had a long history of private conflicts and power struggles that had been quietly swept under the rug. For years, a small group of residents had been making decisions behind closed doors, manipulating the community rules and exerting influence over newcomers. It wasn't just the installation of her video doorbell that had set off this chain of events. It was her decision to disrupt the carefully controlled order that these individuals had worked so hard to maintain. Every action she took, from installing the camera to simply living in the house she had purchased, was a subtle but significant challenge to the power dynamics that governed the area. And that challenge, no matter how small or innocent, could not be allowed to go unchecked. Mark's investigation had revealed something even more disturbing. Rebecca wasn't the first to be targeted in this way. There had been other residents in the past, each of them unique in their own right, who had found themselves at odds with the same group of influential neighbors. They too had made simple decisions, building a fence, installing security cameras, renovating their homes, only to be met with coordinated resistance, threats, and harassment. One by one, these individuals had been driven out, often at great personal cost, and most of them had left the neighborhood without ever fully understanding why they were being targeted. In every case, the campaign of harassment had been subtle at first, just like Rebecca's. At first, it was just rumors, gossip, and veiled threats. But as the victims dug in their heels, The resistance became more direct, more aggressive. And it always ended in the same way. The person would leave, either by choice or because the pressure became too much to bear. It was a system that relied on people's fear of the unknown, on their inability to fight back against a community that seemed to function as a tight-knit unit, and on their lack of knowledge of just how far the hidden power structures in the area could reach. As Rebecca absorbed this information, it became clear to her that the game she was playing wasn't just one of survival. It was one of strategy, manipulation, and power. Her desire to simply live in peace, to be left alone in her new home, was not enough anymore. If she wanted to keep her house, if she wanted to be allowed to exist as a part of the community without being constantly undermined, she had to be more than just reactive. She had to take the initiative. She had to fight back in ways that she hadn't considered before. The first step, she realized, was to start thinking like them, to understand how these forces operated and how they controlled the neighborhood. She couldn't just fight the symptoms of the problem, she needed to attack the source. Rebecca was beginning to see the complexity of the system she had been dragged into. She had assumed that her troubles were the result of a few disgruntled neighbors, people who simply didn't like change. But the more she investigated, the more she saw how interconnected everything was. The seemingly benign HOA, the group of people who managed the neighborhood's rules and regulations, was not just a passive entity that enforced guidelines. It was a highly organized, deliberate force in the community that controlled what people could and couldn't do. It wasn't about maintaining order, as she had initially assumed. It was about maintaining power, about making sure that no one, especially newcomers, ever threatened the delicate balance that had been established over the years. Her next step was clear. She had to go on the offensive. She began attending HOA meetings, sitting quietly in the back, listening, observing. She wanted to see firsthand how these meetings were conducted, to understand the dynamic between the residents and the board members. What she discovered was startling. The meetings, which were supposed to be open and transparent, were anything but. They were a carefully orchestrated performance with the board members playing their parts and everyone else falling in line. There was no real debate, no room for disagreement. Those who did speak up were quickly shut down, their voices drowned out by the members who held the real power. And at the center of it all was Catherine, the woman who had started this whole ordeal, the one who had taken it upon herself to organize the campaign against Rebecca. Catherine wasn't just a concerned neighbor. She was a key player in this game, a gatekeeper who made sure that things stayed exactly as they were. It was at that point that Rebecca realized she wasn't just fighting for her own right to live peacefully in her home. She was fighting for the future of the neighborhood, for the right to bring change to a place that had grown stagnant under the thumb of a few influential people. The more she thought about it, the more she understood that the stakes were higher than she had initially realized. This wasn't just a personal battle. It was a fight for justice, for fairness, for the idea that people should be able to live in peace without fear of being bullied or coerced into submission. She began documenting everything she could, every conversation, every meeting, every instance of harassment. She started to build her case, slowly at first, but with increasing determination. She wasn't going to wait for things to get worse. She was going to take control of the situation, to fight back with everything she had. She reached out to others who had been targeted in the past, people who had been run out of the neighborhood by the same forces that were now working against her. She found that they had never been given a voice, never been allowed to tell their side of the story. Together, they formed a small, quiet coalition, united by a shared sense of injustice and a desire for change. Rebecca's investigation, combined with the information from Mark, started to turn the tide. She realized that if she was going to make it through this, she couldn't just rely on the law. She had to outthink them, outmaneuver them, and use their own tactics against them. The more she learned, the more she understood the game they were playing. And now, she was ready to play it too. Rebecca had always prided herself on her ability to remain calm under pressure, to think logically and act with precision. But as the weeks went by, and her battle with the neighbors and the shadowy powers behind them intensified, she found herself pushed further and further into a corner. What began as a simple conflict over a video doorbell had escalated into a full-blown war, one in which every move she made seemed to be met with retaliation. It wasn't just her property that was under attack anymore. It was her very existence in the neighborhood. The pressure was mounting from all sides, and as much as she had prepared herself to stand her ground, she knew that things were about to get a lot more complicated, a lot more dangerous. The tipping point came one evening, when Rebecca came home from work to find her front door ajar. Her heart skipped a beat as she quickly approached, fearing the worst. She had become accustomed to the small intrusions. The note slipped under the door, the occasional disturbance outside her window, the strange cars parked on her street at odd hours. But nothing had prepared her for the sight she encountered now. The door was wide open, and as she stepped inside, she immediately felt the shift in the air. It wasn't just the feeling of something being out of place, it was the unmistakable sense of having been violated, of her personal space being invaded in the most intimate way possible. She stepped into the hallway and looked around, noticing that nothing appeared to be out of place at first glance. But as she moved further into the house, she began to realize that things were different. Her carefully curated space, the home she had worked so hard to make her own, felt foreign, almost as if it were no longer hers. Items had been moved, shifted ever so slightly, and there was a strange coldness in the air. But it wasn't just the physical space that had been violated. It was something deeper, something more insidious. The sense of security that had once been her refuge, the feeling that she had finally found a place to call her own, was now gone. In its place was a pervasive unease, a knowledge that her every move was being watched, scrutinized, and manipulated. Rebecca stood in the middle of her living room trying to steady her breath as her mind raced, but there was no denying it. Someone had been in her house. They had crossed the line. At that moment, something inside her shifted. She had spent weeks trying to understand the dynamics at play, trying to outthink her opponents and find ways to protect herself. But this was different. This wasn't just a passive campaign of harassment. This was a direct, deliberate attack. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to scare her anymore. They were trying to break her, to strip away her sense of control, and they were succeeding. But Rebecca wasn't going to let that happen. Not now. Not after everything she had been through. She immediately contacted Alice, her lawyer, who was quick to respond. "Rebecca, this is getting serious," Alice said when Rebecca described what had happened. "This is no longer about the camera or some petty neighborhood squabble. This is a violation, and we need to take immediate action." Alice advised Rebecca to file a police report and to document every instance of harassment or intrusion, no matter how small. But Rebecca knew that the police weren't going to be much help. They had already dismissed her earlier complaints as trivial. The system that was supposed to protect her had failed her at every turn. She couldn't rely on that anymore. She had to take matters into her own hands. The next day, she took the first steps toward securing her home in a way she had never done before. She hired a security expert to install state-of-the-art cameras around the perimeter of her property, as well as motion sensors and alarms that would alert her to any intrusion. But even as she made these changes, she knew that the problem wasn't going to be solved by technology alone. She had to take control of the situation in a more direct, personal way. Rebecca began speaking to more of her neighbors, trying to get a sense of who might be behind the recent escalation. She had learned enough from Mark's investigation to know that there were key figures in the community, people who held influence, who had the power to manipulate events behind the scenes. It was these people she needed to focus on, and she quickly realized that Catherine was at the center of it all. Catherine was no longer just a passive participant in the drama that had unfolded. She was actively leading the charge, organizing the efforts against Rebecca and ensuring that no one in the neighborhood would stand up for her. Rebecca knew that she couldn't fight this battle alone. She needed allies, people who had the courage to speak out against the forces that were trying to push her out. And, just as she had hoped, she found a few. There were other residents, those who had lived in the neighborhood long enough to see the undercurrents of control and manipulation, who had been silent out of fear. But now, seeing Rebecca stand up for herself, they found their voices. Together they formed a small group, each person offering whatever they could: information, support, or simply a voice that could be heard. But the more Rebecca pushed back, the more determined Catherine and her allies became. The harassment didn't stop with the invasion of her home. No, it intensified. Late-night phone calls became more frequent, and they weren't just silent anymore. Now there were messages. Threats, insults, and cruel taunts, all meant to break Rebecca's spirit. The strange cars that had been parked outside her house now seemed to follow her wherever she went, keeping a careful distance but never quite letting her out of their sight. Her life had become a never-ending cycle of watching her back, of wondering who was watching her, and of trying to navigate the complicated network of people who seemed to be orchestrating every move she made. Rebecca's patience was wearing thin. She had done everything she could to protect herself, but it was becoming clear that nothing short of confronting the source of this harassment directly would put an end to it. She had spent so much time trying to avoid conflict, trying to live her life in peace, but now she realized that peace wasn't something that could be achieved through avoidance. It had to be fought for, earned through strength and determination. And so, Rebecca decided to take the next step. She would confront Catherine face to face. She wasn't going to let her manipulate the situation any longer, wasn't going to let her control the narrative. The time for passive defense was over. This was her life, her home, and no one had the right to take it from her. With a mixture of resolve and trepidation, Rebecca knocked on Catherine's door one late afternoon, determined to find out exactly what it was that Catherine wanted, why she was so intent on destroying Rebecca's life. As Catherine opened the door, her expression was cold, but not surprised. It was as if she had been expecting this moment, as if she had been waiting for Rebecca to finally take the bait. "What do you want, Rebecca?" Catherine's voice was calm, almost too calm, as she looked down at Rebecca with barely concealed disdain. "I want to know why you're doing this," Rebecca replied, her voice steady but filled with an intensity she hadn't realized she was capable of. "What did I do to deserve this? Why are you making my life a living hell?" Catherine's eyes narrowed, but instead of answering, she stepped aside, allowing Rebecca into her home. What followed was a tense, uncomfortable conversation, one that left Rebecca more determined than ever to expose the truth. Catherine's motives were becoming clearer by the minute. This wasn't just about a doorbell or a few petty complaints. This was about control, power, and a system that had been built on the manipulation of others. And Rebecca wasn't going to let it stand any longer. Rebecca had spent weeks preparing for this moment, piecing together every fragment of evidence she had collected, studying every conversation and every move that Catherine and her supporters had made. It was clear now that the neighborhood, as idyllic as it seemed on the surface, had been built on a system of manipulation and control that allowed a select few to dictate the lives of others. Catherine wasn't just a neighbor with a personal vendetta. She was the key figure in a network of people who had worked together for years to maintain the power dynamics that defined the area. And now, Rebecca had become their target. But no longer would she sit in silence. No longer would she cower in fear. This was no longer just about the video doorbell or her right to peace and security. This was a fight for her home, her dignity, and her place in the world. The day she confronted Catherine had been both terrifying and liberating. It was clear that Catherine had been anticipating this moment, though she didn't show it outright. Instead, she maintained the same cold, calculated demeanor, as if the truth of her actions no longer mattered. Rebecca could see the contempt in her eyes, the way Catherine subtly tried to manipulate the conversation, deflecting and downplaying her role in what had become a full-scale campaign against Rebecca. But Rebecca wasn't going to let Catherine control the narrative any longer. She wasn't going to be the one silenced, the one pushed aside. This time she would stand her ground, and she would fight back. As the days passed, Rebecca found herself putting the final pieces of her plan into place. She had gathered witnesses, documented every instance of harassment, and compiled a comprehensive case that showed just how deeply entrenched the corruption in the neighborhood was. She had met with a team of lawyers, experts in property law and civil rights, who had helped her identify the illegalities and violations that Catherine and her group had committed. It was a long shot, but Rebecca knew she had to take the risk. She couldn't let this go on. She couldn't let the people who had made her life hell continue to get away with it. The time for passive resistance was over. Now it was time for action. The court date was set, and with it came a sense of urgency. Rebecca had never imagined that her fight for a video doorbell would escalate to something like this, a courtroom battle with her home, her future, and her very sense of self on the line. But as she sat in the courtroom preparing to face Catherine and her allies, Rebecca felt a surge of determination. This was more than just a legal dispute. It was about taking back control of her life, about reclaiming her home from the forces that had conspired to take it from her. She wasn't going to let them win. Not now, not ever. The trial was a grueling affair. Catherine, with her polished demeanor and carefully rehearsed words, was a formidable opponent. She stood before the court with an air of smug superiority, as if she already knew the outcome. She had been the one to orchestrate the campaign against Rebecca, the one who had used every underhanded tactic at her disposal to manipulate the neighborhood, to bend the rules to her will. And now she was determined to win at any cost, to crush Rebecca and make sure she knew her place. But Rebecca wasn't intimidated. She had the truth on her side, and she wasn't about to back down. With each piece of evidence she presented, with every witness who spoke out in her favor, Rebecca could see the cracks in Catherine's facade. Catherine's carefully constructed narrative was beginning to fall apart, and Rebecca could sense it. The lies were being exposed for what they were, and Catherine's calm, collected exterior was starting to crack under the weight of the truth. The pivotal moment came when Rebecca presented the final piece of evidence, a recording of one of Catherine's conversations with a former resident of the neighborhood, a woman who had been forced to leave years ago after a similar campaign of harassment had driven her out. The woman, who had once been too afraid to speak out, had found the courage to come forward and testify in Rebecca's defense. In the recording, Catherine was heard bragging about how she and her supporters had made sure that anyone who challenged the community's unspoken rules would be driven out, using whatever means necessary. It was a damning piece of evidence, one that exposed Catherine's true motives and revealed the extent of the corruption within the neighborhood. As the recording played in the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted. The tension that had been building for days finally broke, and Rebecca could see the shock and disbelief in the eyes of the jurors, in the expressions of the judge and the attorneys. Catherine had been exposed, her lies laid bare for everyone to see. She could no longer hide behind her carefully crafted persona of concern and propriety. The truth had come to light, and it was undeniable. Catherine's reaction was swift, her composure shattering in an instant. She tried to deny the recording, to dismiss it as a fabrication, but the damage had already been done. Her allies, those who had supported her in her campaign against Rebecca, began to distance themselves, realizing that their actions had been part of something far more sinister than they had originally believed. One by one, they withdrew their support, leaving Catherine standing alone in the face of the truth. Rebecca felt a sense of vindication wash over her as the judge ruled in her favor. The court recognized the illegal tactics that Catherine and her supporters had employed, and they were ordered to pay restitution for the emotional and financial damages Rebecca had suffered. But the ruling was about more than just money. It was about justice, about standing up against a system of intimidation and control, about taking back the right to live freely and peacefully. Rebecca had won. She had fought for her home, for her dignity, and for the right to live without fear of harassment. As she left the courtroom, Rebecca couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. though it was tempered by the knowledge that the battle had been hard won. The journey had been long, filled with moments of doubt and fear, but in the end, she had prevailed. The neighborhood that had once tried to push her out was now forced to confront the consequences of their actions. Catherine, stripped of her power and influence, had been forced to face the truth. And as Rebecca walked out into the sunlight, her steps were light, her heart full, knowing that she had fought for something far greater than just her own home. She had fought for the right to stand tall in the face of adversity, to live a life free from fear, and to reclaim what was rightfully hers. When it was all over and the court had ruled in her favor, Rebecca didn't feel triumphant or victorious. Instead, what settled inside her was a deep, hard-earned sense of relief, as if she had finally come up for air after being held underwater for far too long. The house, once the battleground of a fight she never asked for, regained its original meaning, not just as a structure with four walls, but as a symbol of resilience, personal boundaries, and the quiet courage to confront fear and intimidation. She no longer felt watched, no longer glanced over her shoulder or froze at every unexpected sound near her windows. The silence that once seemed so ominous had become her companion again. The neighbors who had stood silently on the sidelines now looked at her differently, not with hostility, but with a quiet, sometimes reluctant respect. Some even approached her hesitantly, offering apologies or half-spoken acknowledgments of what she had endured, and Rebecca accepted them without bitterness or triumph, because what mattered most was that she stayed. She no longer felt like an outsider in the neighborhood, yet she didn't seek to belong to anyone's circle anymore. Her boundaries had been drawn clearly, and no one dared to cross them again. Catherine, having lost her influence and credibility, tried to fade from view as though hoping to be forgotten.